So yeah, we'll get started with the webinar. So yeah, welcome to the ABMI Wetland Inventory webinar, presented by myself, Fiona, and Agatha. All right, so presentation outline, just to go over what we're going to talk about. A brief intro into wetlands and the data we're going to be using. I won't get too much into that. The meat of this will be the technical methods. So what Earth observation data we're going to be using, machine learning methods, really the technical details of how to produce a wetland inventory over a large area. So this will be split into 3 regions. The boreal forest region will be done by myself, Rocky Mountain region by Fiona, and the prairies or southern Alberta by Agatha. And then I think this important step, just describing the strengths and limitations of the data we produced, and data like this, what the limitations and strengths of it are going to be. And then some interesting slides on future research and development, how we plan to improve it and how we plan to move forward with monitoring wetlands and water in Canada and Alberta. And then finally, hopefully a good question period. Okay, Brett gave a quick intro to the ABMI. I'll give another one. Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute. Yeah, it's really main mission, track changes in Alberta's wildlife and their habitats from border to border. So of course, this involves mapping wetlands and monitoring it from border to border. Operating principles, really try to be independent. Scientifically credible is very important. Transparent, so we're publishing all our data, doing these webinars. So we're showing knowledge transfer and relevant and accessible. All right, so wetlands. I'm not a wetland ecologist, so I won't get too much in this, but you always say wetlands are nature's kidneys. So the Alberta wetland policy definition there, land saturated with water long enough to promote water-altered soils and water-tolerant vegetation, pretty much. And you can get into the importance of wetlands a lot. I won't get too much into it. Lots of scientific literature out there. The main reason for it is at the ABMI is they're ecologically diverse, so very unique habitats for a lot of species. This is pretty important. Also, flood remediation in the prairie potholes. This is pretty important when you get a lot of runoff from snow or rainfall. All the waters are going to first drain into these pothole wetlands and really remediate the flooding downstream in lakes and or rivers. And important lately, certainly, is the carbon storage. So this is important in the boreal, where you're having these large peatland complexes, which end up storing really a ton of carbon. Okay, so pretty simple goal we had for this. So it was really map wetlands across all of Alberta at the wetland class level. A simple yet lofty goal. So to go along with this, we want it to be up to date. So we wanted it to be fairly recent, 2020, 2021, 2019, like that. So at the class level, if people aren't familiar with Canadian wetland classification or the Alberta wetland classification system, you can see this on the right. So we want to do this at the class level, which is the bog, fen, swamp, marsh, shallow open water. We didn't really deal with shallow open water too much. Water depth with Earth observation data is pretty tricky, so we just lumped shallow open water into one. And we also wanted consistent methods within reason, knowing different areas would probably have slightly different methods. We wanted methods that would not be completely different in one area, so you couldn't really compare data across all of Alberta. And at the beginning, we really wanted to use the best current technology for large-scale mapping. Within price range too, we didn't want it to be crazy expensive. So really here we utilized a lot of the open access data. We use Google Earth Engine for processing a lot of it, because at the time that was the current best technology. And finally, pretty important part, freely available product. We want to publish the data online, anyone can use it. We'll publish all our codes, all our methods to really promote knowledge transfer, data transfer, so we can really grow, collaborate on products like this. All right, a little background into why it's needed. As said before, we want a really spatially consistent one. So one is just to improve current Alberta wetland data or Canadian wetland data. So right now, as you can see on the right, various projects going into the merged wetland inventory. It's generally good data, but since there's a lot of seams between the data, different projects done in different years, done with different resolutions and input data. Some areas are really, really good, and then you get a seam to the next one, it's not quite as good. So large scale analysis of the whole province becomes a little difficult. And as you can see, it's not complete for all of Alberta there. The national parks areas, Wood Buffalo and the Rocky Mountain area, does not have full coverage. Additionally, the wetland data is needed for things like the biodiversity management framework, which the government of Alberta is doing. So this needs data for wetland data for large areas, really. Complete coverage of the province for their aquatic and fen cover indicators. And even internally at the ABMI, we have need for better wetland data for our species model. And again, once you have a decent baseline across the whole province, it's really important just for monitoring efforts. Once you have a baseline, you can use even Earth observation again to just consistently monitor these wetlands and observe the changes to them. All right, so first, now getting into the technical details, I'm going to go over the first of the three regions, the boreal forest region. So this is going to give you a little intro as to what these wetlands look like from the air, from Esri imagery here, and then what they look like in the field. So generally, these are characterized by broad, extensive peatland areas transitioning from upland forest to a fen habitat here. This is a pretty broad peatland area. So you can see the zoomed in image there, kind of your classic peatlands with larches there, pretty wet. This is probably a more southern boreal habitat. The north will look a little different, but this is a pretty good example. All right, so the key distinction in this area is really using deep learning to capture complex wetland structures. So in this area, it's by far the largest, number one, and there's a large variety of wetland classes and forms. So it has all the classes, but then within there, it has lots of different forms too. So you can have tree, shrub, graminoid, fen, lots of different kinds of swamps, different kinds of bogs as well. So there's a large variety because it's such a large area as well. We really needed a deep learning algorithm actually to capture these complex wetland structures. Additionally, for this area, we actually had a large amount of training data, which again makes deep learning quite a bit easier when you have lots of label data for the area. So yeah, again, pretty large area. You can see the context where it is in Alberta. So yeah, we're pretty much using a deep learning UNet CNN to classify wetland class in this region. So the initial analysis in here showed there actually wasn't much difference between wetland classes using the open access Earth observation data. So this is the Sentinel1, Sentinel2, and topographic data. So the example on the right is the anthocyanin reflectance index, showed for all of those wetland classes, and they're pretty similar. So if you're feeding data into a machine learning algorithm and there's not actually any difference between the classes, it doesn't really matter. You're not going to get great results. So just at a pixel numerical level, there wasn't a ton there. There was better ones than this, but again, there wasn't much differentiation of these classes. So we decided we really needed information derived from convolutional filters to separate classes. So a human can tell where these classes occur based on contextual information, textural information of the vegetation. So we figured a deep learning algorithm was probably the most applicable for this area. Okay, so I mentioned the data already, but this is the data that's pretty consistent across most of our methods. So we're using Sentinel2, 10-meter resolution for a lot of the optical properties, measuring vegetation. We're using SAR really to measure the hydrodynamics of water and even vegetation properties from Sentinel1. So both 10 to 20 meter resolution. And again, Google Earth Engine helped out a lot with this, processing all of this data for a relatively small team, being able to do this over the whole province or country province-wide scale. Google Earth Engine's a huge help to this. So the labels, as I said, this is probably the most important part in this step, having a lot of high quality labels to feed into a deep learning algorithm. So our labels are from our 3x7 photo plots, which we plan to have covered approximately 5% of the province. We didn't fully get there, but for the boreal forest region, we have pretty good coverage. So they're generated from high resolution 3D photo interpretation. So there's like 10,000 wetland polygons in here that are spatially explicit and pretty high resolution. So what you're going to do for training is you're going to take this wetland polygon here on the right, and you're going to take a patch of that, so it can take all the contextual information from where that wetland generally occurs, as marshes usually have the transition into small water bodies there, as you can see. And then you're going to stack those up, essentially. All right, I'm not going to get too much into the weeds on the modeling, just for people's knowledge. There's a UNet convolutional neural net architecture. Again, we use three pretty much data sources: optical, SAR, and topographic, all threw it in there. Trained on 4,800 patches of label data. 224 by 224 means how many pixels the patch was, and 16 depth or 16 layers was the how many layers went in there. So all the optical, so how many data sets or raster layers went in there. And if you do want to read more on this, feel free to do the paper on the left here. That will have all the technical details here, kind of comparing this method to a classic shallow learning random forest XGBoost. All right, quickly into the results. This is what they look like. So we have open water in blue, fen in green, bog in the standing out pinkish red, marsh in tan, and swamp in the darker green. So what I really like about this is it represents pretty ecologically meaningful boundaries. Generally, you have the broad peatland complexes with bog and fen, and then the areas transitioning to upland were turned black here. You see swamps along the edges, and then marsh in certain distinct areas. So we can see what that looks like in Google Earth imagery, go back and forth. So yeah, it represents good ecological patterns and how wetlands typically form in the environment. All right, so accuracy, this is what lots of people, of course, want to know about. So you can see the confusion matrix here. Again, the things to highlight here, really good differentiation just of wetland, open water, and upland areas. We can do this very well, reliably. We know where wetlands are with fairly high accuracy. Getting into some of the classes is not quite as accurate. We don't have a ton of data to go on here that differentiates some of these classes. I think improvement of the label data can be a little better. And it should be noted, these accuracies, I mean, the 3x7s are good because they're unbiased sampling of the landscape. So you're not having really pure samples in there. So the accuracies tend to be slightly lower. They generate a more robust model. But yeah, the accuracies for some, get that into the limitations. Could be a little higher for some. And then you can see the F1 score for all those. So again, pretty decent for fen. Marsh is decent. And then, of course, upland, open water. We have high accuracies there. All right, and I'm going to hand this off to Fiona for the Rocky Mountain region.
Thank you, Evan. Can anybody see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. So the Rocky Mountain region, as you may expect, the main determinant of where wetlands can be is the topography. So basically you can only have them in the river valleys and the few flatter areas that you get between the mountain ranges. 4.9 million hectares of Rocky Mountains in Alberta. And so, although we do have photo plot data there, because there's relatively few wetlands, that meant fewer examples of the wetlands within the training data. There was no bog, so we just classified fen, swamp, and marsh. And to augment the training data a bit, we extended the study area 10 kilometers into the foothills, just for the purpose of the training collection and modeling. In addition, we collected a few more sites from kind of a unique source, the Google Map panoramic photospheres, like the one you just saw in the animation. They're contributed by members of the public, but ABMI interpreted them, and in some cases there was a wetland feature large enough to be seen on the imagery that we could use. This only ended up being a small proportion of the total training and validation data, but it did help for aerial and class coverage. The Rocky Mountain classification workflow was almost entirely done in Google Earth Engine. It was object-oriented classification. And so a main feature of that was the simple non-iterative clustering segmentation algorithm in Google Earth Engine. We inputted the 10-meter Sentinel2 bands, visible and near infrared, for June to September in 2020, and median image of that. And then it was a matter of playing around with the parameters to get segments that look like the wetland features that we want to classify. Unlike other object-oriented classification software, in Google Earth Engine, the segment sizes are dynamic. They change as you zoom in and out. So what you have to do is find a scale, a viewing scale at which the segments look the way you want, and then you do your processing and export at that scale. In this case, that was 5 pixels per square meter. The variables used for the, in this case, a random forest classification model came from Sentinel2 and topographic derivatives of the ALOS digital elevation model. For Sentinel2, we used all the bands, visible, red edge, near infrared, and shortwave infrared, and selected indices, both normalized difference water indices, enhanced vegetation index, and normalized anthocyanin reflectance index. 4 topographic indices, topographic position index calculated with 2 different moving window sizes, topographic wetness index, and valley bottom flatness, which turned out to be the most important variable. Then we made a number of temporal variables based on selected Sentinel2 bands and indices to represent the variability of the wetlands over the growing season, standard deviation over the growing season, and difference between 10th and 90th percentile. And for each of these variables, a mean and a standard deviation could be calculated for each segment. This led to a vast number of potential variables. So they were narrowed down first by exploratory graphical analysis to see which were the most promising for distinguishing between the wetland classes, and then through trial runs of the random forest model, where the least important variables would be eliminated until it started affecting the classification accuracy. This still left 60 variables. This is a high-level overview of the process in Google Earth Engine. The Sentinel2 imagery is compiled from the cloud and then undergoes calculations and reductions, where we get the image variables and the median image, which goes into the SNCC segmentation. Once the segments are made, they can be attributed with image from the image variables and the topographic indices. Then we bring in our labeled points with the classes attached to them, and then the variables from the segments are sampled onto the points, and that becomes the input to the random forest model from which we get our classified image. It was then exported into a GIS environment for post-processing and quality control. Just over 3% of the Rocky Mountain natural region turned out to be water or wetland. So we can barely see it on the zoomed out map. Most common wetland class was swamp, followed by fen and marsh. Overall accuracy of 84.5%, with the individual fen, marsh, and swamp class accuracies mainly in the 60 to 70% range. Here's a sample region within the Rocky Mountains. This is Jasper Lake in the middle here, and you can see how the wetlands occur along the river and creek valleys between the mountain ranges. So now I'll turn it over to Agatha, who will tell you how we tackled Southern Alberta.
Thanks, Fiona. Okay. Please write in the chat if you can't see anything. I'm assuming everyone can hear and see. Well, my name is Agatha, and I'll be presenting on the wetland inventory for the Southern Prairie region of Alberta. This area is characterized by small seasonal pothole wetlands, such as the ones you can see in the Google Street View here, which is a graminoid marsh, as well as treed shrubby swamps. So for this area, we developed a new multi-temporal approach to map wetlands and applied it to an experimental study area seen in gray on the map. That area covers about a third of Alberta's grassland and parkland natural region, which constitutes Southern Alberta, the prairie region. This method focuses on capturing the very small prairie potholes in this region, often less than 1/10 of a hectare in size, and having very distinct seasonal cycles, primarily flooding in the spring due to snowmelt, and then drying out into the summer and into the fall. These prairie potholes, wetlands are often very variable from year to year and can be impacted by human activity, including agriculture. So the primary data source for this region's wetland mapping was Sentinel2 Imagery, which is available in Google Earth Engine, as Evan mentioned. And we compiled Sentinel2 Imagery between April to October for the years 2017 to 2020 that had minimal cloud, snow, and ice cover. We processed the available imagery in orbit-based sections to maximize imagery availability, and resulted with 13 to 15 images per processing section, about half of which had fall conditions, and about 3 to 4 images had spring or summer conditions each. You can see the seasonality of the area in this graphic, with spring having the most flooding. A lot of small pothole wetlands are flooded, and then looking to the summer and fall imagery, a lot of those dry out, and what's remaining in the fall is permanent or semi-permanent water or wetlands. So to capture wetlands that are so dynamic, we set out to map the frequency of flooding, also referred to as hydroperiod or hydrodynamics. And to do so, we created training data by labeling segments. As in the Rocky Mountain region, segments were created using a SNCC, simple non-iterative algorithm applied in Google Earth Engine to representative spring, summer, and fall Sentinel2 imagery per processing section. And these segments were then merged to be more manageable. And you can see the segments in blue outline in the graphic on the slide. The merged segments were then exported from Google Earth Engine at a 2-meter scale and manually labeled in ArcPro as either flood or non-flood. So we labeled about 300 segments per season per processing section, with about 50% as flood and 50% as non-flood. These labeled segments were then re-imported into Google Earth Engine and used as training data for a random forest classifier that was trained on 5,000 pixels and used 50 trees. We also used input data of segment statistics for the classifying images. That was mean and standard deviation for the 10 and 20 meter bands, as well as perimeter with height and area of the segments. The result of the random forest classifier were binary flood, non-flood rasters. And you can see the flooded areas in red and non-flooded as transparent in the graphic. And these rasters were exported at a 2-meter scale from Google Earth Engine to maintain the minimum mapping unit of about 400 to 800 meters squared. So by compiling all those binary non-flood flood rasters per processing section, we were able to calculate flood frequency. So using the sum of those rasters with flood having a value of 1 and non-flood being a value of 0, those summed rasters were then divided by the total of number of rasters per section and then converted into a percentage. And this describes flood frequency. We also quality controlled the hydroperiod data using a topographic wetness index to exclude falsely flooded sloped areas that had shadows, as well as human footprint masks to exclude anthropogenic disturbances, and some manual exclusion, such as removing some wet soil areas in agricultural fields that weren't actually wetlands. So as a result, we have the hydroperiod product shown in this map. We found that 5% of the study area was flooded at some point during the 2017 to 2020 time period. And you can see those flooded areas are mostly light green or light yellow, which are infrequently flooded, so 1 to 20% flood frequency. Using the generated hydroperiod data, we were able to assign a water permanence type. So we stratified the flood frequency into 4 categories to describe temporary, seasonal, semi-permanent, and permanent open water. And then using canopy height data derived from spaceborne LiDAR, in this case JEDI, we were able to group these flooded areas into the wetland class of either marsh or swamp, as those are the 2 primary wetland classes in this region. So areas that were less than 2 meters mean vegetation height were classified as marsh, and those with mean vegetation height greater than 2 meters were classified as swamp. This map shows the wetland inventory for the study area to the wetland type level. You can see most of those infrequently flooded areas are now classified as either temporary or seasonal marshes in these 2 lighter yellow colors. And we found that most of the swamps were found closest to the Rockies on the western edge of the study area. Here's a nice graphic that kind of summarizes the multi-seasonal approach for the southern Alberta region, using example imagery from spring, summer, and fall to train data, and then using all available imagery and classifying on a seasonal basis. We were able to derive the hydroperiod data, and then combining the canopy height data from spaceborne LiDAR JEDI, we were able to classify wetlands to the wetland type level. So here is the final class level wetland inventory product derived from this method. We already fused the results from that experimental study area into the Alberta-wide inventory. And we've also created a simplified product using only 3 Sentinel2 images, 1 per season, to fill in a couple gaps that we had around Calgary and Edmonton to create a wall-to-wall inventory. Here you can see the wetland class and the Google Earth imagery. We also conducted an accuracy assessment with independent photo interpreted data and found an overall high accuracy of 90%. So We are hoping to continue, or we plan to continue to apply this newly developed multi-temporal approach to mapping small seasonal wetlands in the prairie southern Alberta region, as well as applying it to other areas that have prairie potholes, including Saskatchewan. Okay, now it's back to Evan.
Thank you, Agatha. I'll share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that and hear me. Okay, so putting all those together, we get our final wetland inventory. You can see the data download links here if you want to download it, if you want to give us feedback, if you want to use it. And then we also have the web map, the Google Earth Engine hosted web map, if you want to look at it before for your study region, for example. We can probably send out those links as well in the chat. But on the map on the right, pretty much you can see a lot of wetlands in the boreal. In some areas, it's like 50% wetlands in there, those large, extensive peatlands. In the prairies, you can just see those dotted wetlands, either marsh or swamp, and a lot of temporary ones in that area. The Rockies, you can't really see them from the zoomed out map, as Fiona said, but the insets show where they typically form in the river valleys there. Broad, extensive boreal areas with peatlands and the potholes. The potholes in southern Alberta. So a little bit about the strengths. I guess number one, complete coverage of Alberta using pretty similar input data. Everything's based off 10-meter resolution data, fairly similar methods using similar training data, etc. One sec, there we go. All right, and we also have, as I said before, in all cases, we have very good wetland, upland, and open water accuracy. So if you want to know where wetland areas are, this is pretty high accuracy. Upland areas, of course, that's pretty easy if you're using topography, as these areas aren't going to have any seasonal water or aren't going to ever be flooded. And then open water, a long history there, remote sensing of identifying open water. And then, yeah, I think another strength is capturing all the temporary wetlands in the prairies. Because of the multi-temporal approach, can really get those wetlands which occur, they're not even going to occur every year when they flood, even for a few months after snow melt in this area. They're going to be very temporary areas, and they might not even show up in some cases on a fall Esri or Google Earth image, as they're sometimes plowed over by fields, but they are temporary wetland depressions that do reliably flood. And I also think wetland boundaries that are ecologically meaningful. So with knowledge of on-the-ground wetland formation, the maps actually and the data actually match what we'd expect, the transition from peatlands to swamps, and how prairie potholes form as well, those small round pothole depressions. And another good thing, I mean, relatively easy to rerun. I say relatively, here it's still work, but we know how to do it now. So we can put new input or training data in, rerun all the results, see what we get. If we're going for monitoring, again, we can rerun it all. There's a lot of research into this, certainly, doing now time series analysis of wetlands. So the limitations, you might have seen it in the big map. There is a seam between the prairies and boreal. Pretty easy explanation for this is that we're getting all the temporary wetlands in the prairies in the south region, and in the boreal, this was a much more static approach. We did not have as many temporary marshes in this area, but they still, of course, exist. But you'll have many more of those pothole temporary marshes in the south area, as you can see here, the seam between them. And then the transition to the boreal does not have it currently. This is our first update we'll be doing, particularly in agricultural regions in the boreal. We'll just fill this in using the multi-temporal approach to capture those usually temporary to seasonal marshes. So this will hopefully remove that seam. More limitations, as mentioned before, we have less confidence in some classes, certainly in the boreal and Rocky Mountain region. That's just maybe due to the difficulty in distinguishing some of those classes with current optical and SAR data. But we'll get into the research and development a little more. This will probably change with new input data or slight alterations to our label data. And in the south, you might see in some areas somewhat poor Sentinel-2 images for the western prairies. This area from Edmonton to Calgary, the Sentinel-2 orbital path wasn't great, or it was really cloudy all the time. So our ability to capture all the seasonal wetlands in that area were actually pretty difficult. So I think we're getting less seasonal wetlands in that area compared to other Sentinel-2 orbits. And then overall, I mean, we really have the normal limitations of any large scale Earth observation derived land cover data. A little bit of noise, you'll have somewhat less confidence in other areas when you don't have good training data. So all those things. And then just like large scale data, it's probably not suitable for really detailed site or local level data. If you need really high resolution data, things like photo interpretation are probably still going to get you much better results. So how's the data used? I mean, number one, we're using it internally for species modeling, or we're trying to. For large scale environmental monitoring frameworks where you need really good data or data across a whole province or a whole country, for large scale analysis, such as the biodiversity management framework. And again, baseline for monitoring efforts. Once we are happy with our pretty much static map of wetlands, we can then monitor how those change. And I hope can be a go-to data source for really large scale province-wide wetland data in Alberta. So if you're needing wetland data over all of Alberta with somewhat consistent methods, we hope this can be a go-to data set for that. And overall, we hope this can be a really a jumping off point for sharing the methods, sharing the codes, sharing the knowledge. So it can be even built upon to other areas of the world, other areas of Canada, as is being done already, really. All right, now some of the research and development we're doing, what we're doing moving forward, or what we're currently doing, really. Number one is Sentinel-1 Coherence. So this was provided by Canadian Centre for Mapping and Earth Observation and Kepler. So quick intro to coherence, papers to read out there if you're not familiar with it. It's pretty much the coherence between the phase of the Sentinel-1 image pairs. So 2 weeks apart images, you'll get how coherent the wave is. So if the wave is coherent, this is really an indication of double bounce or flooded vegetation, which is pretty important for wetlands. So we have like 40 images from 2017 to 2020 indicating if your area or the wetland is coherent. And as wetlands are pretty seasonal, you're going to expect a lot of change throughout the year. So here you can see it jumping through all the images. The bright areas being areas that are coherent. We would expect flooded wetlands, especially with trees, when it's not too dense to be coherent. So if we use this data, we pretty much put it into one raster. We can use the mean across those 40 images. We can take the standard deviation and coherence across time, and then put it into a false color RGB, really, or false color composite. So this really helps highlight some of the boreal wetland classes, certainly. So the interpretation here pretty much is you can see the bogs in blue. So the bogs are going to be highly coherent most of the time, like almost all the time. And their standard deviation and coherence doesn't change that much. They're almost consistently coherent. We'll have the fen probably in pink, where you have a pretty high coherence for fen, but it's a little more, it changes a little more throughout the year. Generally, that bright green is where you have high backscatter. So that's just backscatter from Sentinel-1. That really stands out. So those are your upland forest areas. And then other areas, you might have your marsh in red there. And then swamp is usually just the transition from like the fen or the bog into the green upland forest areas. So overall, what does this give us? Much better separation of bog versus fen with the mean and standard deviation of coherence across time. So bog is consistently coherent or highly coherent. Fen varies a lot throughout there. Marsh, not really that often coherent. And then we have swamp kind of mid-between there. But the big thing here, I think, is going to help the bog and fen classification, certainly. So a lot of this work is based off Briscoe and Millard's publications on Sentinel-1 coherence, and there will be a new one, Imani et al. 2021, looking at some of this Alberta coherence data. And yeah, lots of applications outside of just wetland mapping for here. So really coherent change detection is another important application of this data. Currently being done by CCMEO, Wood and Kepler for wetland change detection. So additionally, with getting better data, I think refining the labels is always important. And this is where we're working with Ducks Unlimited Canada. They are really the experts in this area. So redefining these labels and seeing which classes we actually have. So a little bit redefining the bog and fen labels, kind of matching the Alberta wetland mapping standards, which means a slightly smaller MMU on these spatially explicit wetland polygons. So once we can really nail down what classes these actually are, I think our results will improve quite a bit. And then finally, one thing we're also working on is kind of Earth observation wetland functional types. So essentially the thinking here is wetlands can vary along 3 gradients that can be reliably measured by remote sensing. So number 1 is hydrodynamics. So this is really where SAR is very important. And also our prairie pothole one, that's pretty much captured hydrodynamics. So where you have temporary flooding or where you have permanent water or permanent flooding, this can either be captured with the coherence data, either dense optical data or also dense SAR data. So this is really capturing the temporal signature of wetlands. And this all varies on a gradient. It's essentially hydroperiod, how often wetlands flooding, what are the seasonal cycles. Additionally, it varies on vegetation. So you can have a barren mud flat, and then you can also have a pretty heavily treed swamp. So it always varies on here. And additionally, topographic. So you have a valley bottom, a very wet area, which is probably going to be fairly permanently flooded. And you can vary to the near slope where you're having your swamps. So these all these areas exist on a gradient really, and they can be pretty reliably measured with remote sensing. The interesting thing is if you get clusters here, measuring these on all these gradients, and would these reliably match to say the wetland classes that you're seeing in a classification system? It probably wouldn't match perfectly, but it'd be interesting to see classifying wetlands or clustering them into distinct areas based upon these gradients. All right, final thoughts. I mean, pretty much an exciting future for water and wetland monitoring, certainly with Earth observation data. Pretty much download the data or look at the methods. Feel free to give feedback if you do want. As said in the research and development, we'll continue to improve the Alberta-wide wetland product. And we hope these findings and methods can be useful for other groups. Pretty much all these new technologies from SAR, whether that's RCM or NISAR, are going to come out soon. Always increasing high-res optical data, even deep learning algorithm really provide exciting opportunities for water wetland mapping monitoring. So yeah, high temporal resolution, even optical data is really perfectly suited for wetland and water monitoring, especially when you're trying to monitor water dynamics. And new SAR data, either from Sentinel-1 or NISAR, can really be great for detecting sub-canopy water. So when you're not working in open environments and you can see the flooding reliably and you need some penetration into the canopy, new SAR data is going to be very, very exciting there. And then finally, better DEMs. And as we have increased availability of LiDAR, this is always going to help topographic modeling. Pretty much where we would expect water based on topography. All right, I'll mention a few of the collaborators. I guess this was not, we collaborated with a bunch of people here, a bunch of groups, helping a lot of our scientific work for the wetland mapping. So Canadian Centre for Mapping and Earth Observation provided a lot of guidance on the scientific work here. Wood and Secor provided some helps with some of the papers, and we continue to collaborate with them. Ducks Unlimited, important collaboration here, ongoing, and funded through Alberta Environment and Parks. And that is it for us. If you want updates on this, we have our Twitter accounts there. We'll post updates there, and also the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring one. We'll be posting updates on there or interesting figures. And feel free to contact us if you have any questions. And yeah, just generally, yeah, thanks for joining. And if you want to contact, open for certainly all sorts of collaborations. And I think we'll take questions now.
Yeah, we have a few questions already from the chat, Evan.
Sweet. I will stop the recording.